We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Dalet Amar Aleph and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 94a. This daf is sponsored by David Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you'd like to sponsor an Amar Daf, see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amar, the Mishnah was discussing if a buyer buys in large quantities, how much impurity within the quantity is to be expected. And for example, the Mishnah said, let's say a buyer buys grain, so for every saw of grain, it can be expected that there's a quarter kav of impurity in that saw. The buyer is not allowed to say that he wants to go back on the sale if a quarter kav or less of impurity is found within every saw of the grain. And the Gemara on the previous Amud then brought the opinion of Rav Katina that when the Mishnah says a quarter kav of impurity, it specifically means a quarter kav of legumes within every saw of grain. But if there's a quarter kav, let's say of afruris, of actual dirt, so that would be worse, and that does not have to be accepted by the buyer. And the Gemara is in the middle of asking on Rav Katina from a statement of Rabba, or some say it's a statement of Rav. It says, let's say a person removes a pebble from the threshing floor, from the grain, so no sin lo demei chitin, he has to give him the value of wheat, meaning to say, you have to give him the value of wheat because he would have been able to sell that together with the pebble. That would have counted as wheat, meaning afruris, a pebble which is the same as dirt, would count. And so therefore, it seems to be a question against Rav Katina, because Rav Katina said, we're only counting impurities like legumes, we're not counting impurities like afruris, like dirt, or like pebbles. And the Rashbam explains, no sin lo demei chitin, he has to pay him the value of wheat because he removed that pebble, sharei hifchiso b'mida, because what he essentially did was, he made the measure less. Do you have a mazvin lei im hachitin, because he could have sold that dirt together with the wheat. The afruris mekabel lokech, because the buyer does have to accept some amount of dirt. Now you can't go back and mix the dirt back in. That you're not allowed to do. The hashta osa avle b'yadayim, because then you're actively corrupting it. But the point over here is that you see that when the buyer accepts a certain amount of impurity, that dirt is counted. And so the Gemara answers kidneys when it comes to impurities like legumes, so then rova. So then the buyer accepts a quarter of a kav for every saw of grain. But afruris, but when it comes to dirt, so even though some impurity is accepted, but pachos meirov, it's not so much, it is going to be less than a quarter of a kav. But the Gemara continues, va'afruris rov alo, is that really true that if the impurity is dirt, a quarter of a kav would not be good, that would not have to be accepted by the buyer? Va'atanya, but we learned in a brisa, hamocher peiros lechaver, if a person sells produce to his friend, chitin, let's say he's selling wheat, mekabel olav rova kitnios l'saw, the buyer has to accept a quarter of a kav of impurities of legumes for every saw, that's by wheat. So orim, let's say he's selling in barley, mekabel olav rova nishoves l'saw, so then he has to accept upon himself a quarter of a kav of chaff for every saw. And adoshim, let's say he's selling lentils, mekabel olav rova afruris l'saw, he has to accept upon himself a quarter of a kav of dirt for every saw. And the Gemara initially assumes, my lav, is it not? Hu adin lachitin v'lisaorin. The same is going to be true by wheat and barley, meaning the fact that we're saying afruris, dirt, by adoshim, that's not only by adoshim, that would apply by the chitim and saorim as well. A quarter of a kav of dirt would also have to be accepted by the buyer. And the Gemara says, not necessarily. Shani adoshim, it's different by lentils, the miakir akri lahu, because they're getting uprooted from the ground, so it makes sense that there would be dirt mixed in. That's why afruris has to be accepted by adoshim, but not necessarily by chitin and saorin. But the Gemara continues, the reason the Bryce is saying by adoshim that the buyer has to accept dirt is because, again, lentils are something that are uprooted from the ground. But then that would imply the opposite. Wheat and barley, the buyer does not have to accept any dirt. He doesn't have to accept any afruris. And so therefore, from this Bryce, we should learn, tifshot mino, we should learn from this Bryce the opposite. That chiti v'sari, the afruris lo mekabel, that when it comes to wheat and barley, he does not accept afruris. He does not accept any dirt that's mixed in within the wheat and the barley. And the Gemara says not necessarily. Liolam chiti v'sari mekabel, it could be that you could understand the brisa that by wheat and barley also, mekabel afruris, the buyer would accept afruris, he would accept that dirt is mixed in. But adoshim etzrichale, it could be that the brisa specifically was talking about adoshim and afruris because that was necessary. Because one might have thought, kaven de miakir akri lahu, since it's something that's uprooted from the dirt, yoser meirofanami lekabel, maybe the buyer has to accept even more than a quarter kav of dirt within every saw. Kamash malon, so it could be that's what the Bryce is teaching, that even when it comes to adoshim, it's only a quarter of a kav that the buyer has to accept and no more. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Huna says, in Bol and Nafos, if the buyer wants to sift through and find the impurities, Menafes, Kulu, he can sift through the entire thing. And what Rav Huna means to say is that he's entitled to get reimbursed for all the impurities, even the quarter of a kav per saw. Meaning he's not just getting reimbursed for the impurity that's beyond the quarter of a kav, but he can be reimbursed from the whole thing once the the seller has sold him a bunch of produce with impurities that are too much, that go over the quarter kav measure. And the Gemara continues, Amri lo dina v'amri lo kanasa. Some say what Rav Huna is saying is actually the strict halacha that he gets fully reimbursed, not just the impurities that were beyond the quarter of a kav per sa, but v'amri lo kanasa. Some say no, that it's a fine. Really, he should only be reimbursed for the amount of impurity that was in excess of what is allowed, but there's a fine against the seller that he has to reimburse the whole thing. As the Gemara now explains, Amri lo dina, some say that it's the strict halacha, because man de yoav zuze aperi shapira yohiv. When a person is paying money, he's paying to have produce that's free from any impurity. V'rova lo tarachinish. Now, if it's a quarter of a kav per sa, that's not enough to even bother with. People don't bother with that. But yoser merova tarachinish. But if there's a lot of impurity, if there's more than a quarter kav per sa, so a person is going to bother with it. V'kevan de tarach. And now, once he took the effort to actually sift through, he involved himself in the tircha. So tarach bekuli, we say that he involved himself in the tircha. He took the effort for the whole thing, and he should be reimbursed for the entire thing, and that's according to the strict halacha. And the Gemara says, V'yamri lo kanasa, but some say that it's just a fine, because rova shchiach, a quarter of a kav per sa of impurity, so that's common. Yoser lo shchiach, more than that is not common. V'iyu hu da'arvin, so therefore there's a suspicion that he, meaning the seller, actually mixed in an extra amount of impurities. V'kevan da'arvin, since there's such a suspicion that he mixed it in, kansuhu rabbanan bekule, so the rabbanan say that there's a fine on the entire thing. He has to reimburse for the entire amount. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question on Rav Huna from a Mishnah in Kilayim. The Mishnah says, Kol sa sheyesh ba rova mimin acher. Let's say you have seeds, a saw of seeds, and there's a quarter of a kav of a different kind of species of seeds that are mixed in. This is going to be an issue of Kilayim if you plant them together. So you have to minimize, you have to take away those seeds, those other kinds of seeds that cause the problem of Kilayim. And the Gemara now says, Savrua, right now we think, the rova de Kilayim, if you have a quarter kav by Kilayim of other seeds per saw, ki yoser me rova dehacha. That's going to be like having more than a quarter kav when you're talking about a mixture that's between a buyer and a seller, and you have a certain level of impurity. In other words, we think Kilayim is a little stricter. Once it reaches a quarter of a kav, that's already problematic, in the same way that by a sale, more than a quarter of a kav is problematic. V'katani yemait, and what does it say in this Mishnah? It says that you have to take away some of the seeds, not all of the seeds. You just have to take away a certain measure, make it less than a quarter kav. And so therefore, it seems not like Rav Huna. It seems like you just have to be memait, you just take away, but you don't have to take away all of it. And the Gemara says, Lo, no, your assumption is incorrect. Rova de Kilayim, a quarter of a kav by Kilayim, ki rova de hachadami, is actually the same as a quarter of a kav when it comes to a sale. And we say by a quarter of a kav by a sale that that's not a problematic amount. And that's the same thing is true by a quarter of a kav by Kilayim. That's not a problematic amount. But the Gemara says that doesn't make sense. If so, amayimait. If it's not a problematic amount, why do you have to take away anything? Because the Mishnah does say yemait. And so the Gemara answers to that, mishum chumra de kilayim. That's just because we're extra strict when it comes to kilayim, so we say that you have to take a little away. The Gemara says if so, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Daled Amud Beis.